Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first and inaugural episode of the Phreak Show Sideshow, where I do a bunch of nerdy math on questions that you at home have. And our very first episode is going to focus on a question from Francisco Botello, who asks, how much damage will I lose from not having Berserker's Greaves? And how tankier am I really with Tabis? Will Merc Treads actually save me from Diana or Syndra? So let's talk about that one. Well, first of all, here is the short answer. You lose some damage, and it might save you. That's not particularly useful, so let's get into some of the more specific math. For those who really want to follow at home with the math, I'm using level 11 for an AD carry and level 13 for a solo laner for these calculations. That tends to be about the time that AD carries buy boot upgrades, and it's when a solo laner is on about 1.5 items. For further number reference, about 60 armor, 34 magic resist, and 1400 health. You don't need to memorize these. They're going to be generally true no matter what when you're buying these items, but for those of you who are doing the math at home. So what's really nice is these items all cost the same amount of gold, and they give the same amount of movement speed, which means we can directly just compare the attack speed to the magic resist and armor and tenacity and physical attack damage reduction. So that's actually pretty easy. Here's the really quick one. Berserker's Greaves are actually very, very efficient. If you don't pick them up, you lose about 15 to 25% of your auto attack DPS. You're losing up to a quarter of your auto attack damage. And if, as a basic marksman, your goal is to deal damage with auto attacks, this is a very significant loss in power. Now, this can get slightly more complex. It does depend on what champion you're playing. A champion like Senna, for example, has so much essentially intrinsic bonus attack speed that she doesn't even get 15%. It's more like 8. But let's say someone like Xayah, who doesn't have a ton of base attack speed, whenever your W is on cooldown, it's not active, you're getting more like 25% bonus attack speed. Whereas a champion like Tristana, with rapid fire, who gets a ton of attack speed when that buff is on, it's less valuable there. So if it makes sense, the more attack speed you already have, the less you need Berserker's Greaves. And again, in general, you're looking at 15 to 25% less auto attack damage. Now, if you use spells like, say, your Lucian, obviously, auto attacks are less important to you. We're only talking about auto attack DPS here. Callista, Tristana, Xayah, champs who auto attack a ton. Now, Ninja Tabi is 10 to 15% more physical health based on the situation that you're in. The less lethality your opponent has, the more it's only 10% more durability. The more lethality your opponent has, the more it's like 15% more durability. And then even beyond that, Ninja Tabi has a special unique passive that reduces auto attack damage specifically. It doesn't reduce spells, it only reduces auto attack. So if the assassin you're afraid of is someone like Rengar, well, they're very auto attack heavy. Ninja Tabi is even better against them because that 10 to 15% bonus health against generic physical damage is more like 28 to 30% more health if it's purely auto attack based. If you want to survive a Callista who is auto attacking you a whole lot, or a Tristana or a Xayah or something like that, or again like a Rengar, you're looking to be in the 20s to almost even 30% more health. So in a duel, again, we talk about Berserker's Greaves being 15 to 25% more auto attack DPS. If Rengar is, purely doing auto attacks to you, the Ninja Tabi is better in the duel. But again, you have to consider, hey, was I going to be killed or not? Am I in a duel or not? And is my job to win a team fight from the back line or not? Let's go to Mercury Treads. Mercury Treads is 19 to 25% more health, essentially, against magic damage. And once again, this really needs to look at what has my opponent built. If they are just a generic mage with no magic penetration at all, you're looking for that midline, that 19%. But if they are stacking magic pen, like if they have Sork Shoes and Oblivion Orb, you're getting the full 25% more health. Essentially what it comes down to, much like lethality, the more flat reductions they have, the more incentive you have to build armor and magic resist. The less reductions they have, the less incentives you have. You are trying to counter flat magic pen or lethality with buying flat armor or magic resist. Now, we talked about 19% being roughly how much durability you get against someone who doesn't buy Flat Magic Pen. That drops to 12% against Void Staff. If they have already tried to sort of future-proof their purchases and buy a Void Staff early on in the game, like even as early as second item, you're only getting 12% more durability with Void Staff, when again we talk about Berserker's Greaves giving 15 to 25% more damage. Now, if it keeps you from being one-shot, then sure, maybe it's worth it. But if you're just kind of in duels where you're kind of going back and forth, maybe there's a Kaisa and she does magic damage sometimes. It's not worth it in those cases. You're better off just dueling well. And that really is the point we talk about, is that there are caveats here. Even if the durability can be higher, like you're a high attack speed champion against Flat Magic Pen, making Merc Treads better in that case, well, your wave clear is worse, your turret killing is worse, your Baron rush is worse, your Drake kills are worse. That can still be worth it, don't get me wrong, but these are the numbers you have to keep in your mind. They're all doing about 15% kind of, if you want to be really generic about it and be sort of too dull with the math. Pretending they're all 15% is okay enough to kind of keep in the back of your mind. But in realistic terms, it depends on the champion you're playing, the champions you're against, the builds they're using, and how the team fights are taking shape. It's unfortunately a fairly difficult topic, but at least there's some generic math there. Now, what's nice is we can break this down a little bit further. As far as answering that question specifically, we're more or less done here, but I wanted to dive into some of the deeper math here because there's other questions to answer. Jim asked, does Magic Resist really give diminishing returns? And the answer is no, sort of. And kind of. So the, allegory, metaphor I'm going to use is $100 is always $100. Now, if you make a sort of fairly average amount of income, $100 is really useful. It helps you pay off some bills, pay rent, whatever. It's pretty nice. If you're a millionaire, $100 is still $100, but it doesn't have the same use. You've already got the money to pay everything off that you need. That's true with any stat in League of Legends as well. The less health you have, the more you need it. The less armor, magic resist, or attack damage you have, the more you need it, right? You kind of want to make up what your deficits are. So, for example, we're going to have a big graph right here that shows the relative value of 1,000 gold worth of attack speed. And we're going to key this off of how much attack speed you already have. And what's interesting is we're going to see diminishing returns, but only sort of. Or there's not diminishing returns, kinda. It's still true in either case. See, the absolute number of attacks per second you gain by buying some extra attack speed, in this case, 1,000 gold is 40% bonus attack speed, is the exact same amount. You're getting the exact same number of extra attacks per second up until the super late game where you hit the attack speed cap, which most champions don't, so forget about it. You're getting the same absolute value every single time. The relative value, though, diminishes, right? Getting extra 0.25 attacks per second is really meaningful when you only attack once per second. It's 1/4 more attacks. When you attack twice per second, it's only 1/8 more attacks. So it's sort of diminishing returns, but it's still an extra 0.25 attacks per second. So which is it? Well, here's the fun thing. I would say, in general, the champion with high attack speed tends to have attacks worth multiplying, right? They've got a Wit's End or a Blade of the Ruin King or an Infinity Edge or something else really useful that's worth adding 0.25 attacks per second to. A champion like Nautilus, who doesn't have any bonus attack speed almost at all anywhere, yeah, percentage-wise is a big deal, but in actual DPS, who cares? Well, with attack speed, it's the same thing. I am Ashe on 4 items. Even if it's only 10% more auto attacks, well, I'm doing 400 damage per auto. That's a lot of DPS. That's great. I want that. And that's what ends up being actually true, is that it's sort of diminishing returns on a relative scale, but the absolute value almost tends to go up. And this exact same thing works with armor, and it works with magic resist. We're just kind of going in order because we're talking about Berserker's Greaves and Mercury Treads Ninja Tabi. So let's talk about Mercury Treads, or let's talk about magic resist in general. What is the value of 1,000 gold worth of MR, depending or based off of how much MR I already have? Well, if your base MR is 0, like you are a typical AD carry and your opponent has Sork Shoes and an Oblivion Orb, your MR is basically 0. Well, that is the biggest gain. 1,000 gold worth of MR is 55.5 repeating magic resist. If you're like somehow buying pieces of null magic mantles forever, it's not realistic, but it's a gold cost. It's 55% more durability, right? We talked about 1,000 gold of attack speed is 40% more attack speed or 40% more attacks. 1,000 gold of MR is 55% more health. That is very, 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 very good. And if you are against someone who's building a bunch of flat pen, look at the value you're getting out of buying flat MR. It's realistic to buy a Negatron Cloak and stop in a real game of League of Legends if you're looking for efficient magic damage durability. That's completely acceptable to do because it's a lot of durability against flat pen. But as time goes on, as your MR grows, let's say you have 210 MR already, that same 1,000 gold is only 18% more magic damage durability. It's diminishing returns, kind of, because it's still, if you're this mythical champion with 1,000 health, it's still 555 bonus HP, but 555 health is less and less and less relatively useful in that case. Caveat, though, much like we talked about attack speed, where Ashe, even if she has a lot of attack speed, tends to have the stats to back up buying more attack speed. A champion like Ornn, or maybe Darius, or Zac, or Sejuani, even if they have a lot of magic resist and the relative value is only 20% when it could have been 50%, and it feels like you're getting diminishing returns, you're not really, because they have a lot of health, right? These are champions with 3,000, 3,500, maybe 4,000 HP, and 20% more is the most efficient thing you could ever buy because 20% more of 4,000 health. That's really, 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 really good. So it has diminishing returns, but only kind of, because the true value, the actual value, the absolute value actually keeps growing and growing and growing and growing. So it almost scales up over time, even if the percentages don't change by as much anymore. Now we can look at that in a different way by comparing it to Void Staff. When you're up against a Void Staff, it squashes both the MR that you buy and the MR that you have. What this means is there is still a point somewhere on the line where it is correct to buy a Negatron Cloak. The percentages are all lower, the absolute gain are all lower, but there is a point in time where you say, Negatron is worth it when it gives me 25% more health. And when you're not against Void Staff, that number is 120 MR. When you are against Void Staff, that number is, I'm backwards in this one. When you aren't against Void Staff, it's 135 MR. And when you are against Void Staff, it's at 60. Right. Your actual gains are kind of pushed almost favorably in a certain way. So random to look at. I know we're going into a bit more of the chart ramble, but just to sort of teach you some more of these concepts here is that there is only some level of diminishing returns, and essentially Void Staff moves your break points back in a certain way. Now, finally, we can talk about armor, and it's very, very similar. One thing I want to bring up, actually, before we talk about armor real quick, is this magic resist chart. Or this graph, I should say, because the generic ranged champion starts at 30 MR and scales up to just below 40. And unless you buy other sources of magic resist or you have significant investment in runes, you're kind of confined to the 30 to 40 range, which means almost no matter when you buy this item or buy this stat, 1,000 gold of MR is going to be always worth about 40% more durability against magic resist. Again, we compared to attack speed. 1,000 gold worth of attack speed was up to 40% more auto attack damage, but as time went on, down to as low as 10%. The magic resist tends to stay pretty flat for a generic range champion, and it stays around 40%. FYI, there's the number, and you can use that in the back of your mind to always kind of consider that piece. We can do the same thing, though, for armor. Armor is very slightly more expensive, so 1,000 gold worth of armor is 50 armor. Okay, well, again, if you mythically had 0 armor, you're against a full lethality stacker who brought you all the way to 0. Well, no surprise, 50 armor is 50% more durability against that source of damage. And that is really, really, really effective. An item like Chain Vest and even Ninja Tabi, though it's a bit less efficient than Chain Vest, is very, very good against assassins. It is why people tend to buy defensive boots against assassins of that damage type, because the closer you are to 0, the more that matters on a relative scale. As we move on, as you level up, as other champions don't buy lethality, the percentage gain indeed shrinks. All the way down to a tank with 225 armor is only getting 15% more durability with, buying a full 50 armor on top. Ultimately, that is still the choice you have to make. And still have to consider that a champion who buys more than 200 armor is probably Ornn with a Forge Fire cape and a Gargoyle Stone Plate or an Iceborne Gauntlet or something else. They've got a lot of health to then multiply. So even though the percentages shrink over time, the absolute value may still gain. Ultimately, that is the answer. That is the question we're trying to answer here is, does it have diminishing returns? No, not really. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It kind of depends on the situation that you're in. And as far as are Berserker's Greaves correct to sacrifice for Mercury Tethered Ninja Tabi? Well, ultimately, it does depend on the situation. But Berserker's Greaves tend to be 15 to 25% more auto attack DPS. And Mercury Treads tends to be almost to the same scale, about 19 to 25% more magic health. If you're dying to pure magic damage and you can't get more auto attacks off because of that burst, it might be worth it. Ninja Tabi, because it's even less stats, is only 10 to 15% more physical health, unless that kill is auto attack focused, in which case it shoots right back up and is above 25%. End of the day, it is a judgment call. These things are fairly close together. They are reasonably well balanced against one another, and it's up to you as a player to figure out, is it worth the sacrifice? It can be hard to know, but that's the answer. That's it for the first episode of the Phreak Show Sideshow. Please leave some comments down below with other questions you would like answered and give me feedback on how to make this show even better. I'm going to be happy to learn how to make this the best it can be. Once again, thanks for watching. I hope you learned something, and we'll see you next time.